Okay, everyone. All right. It's so good to see everyone here. Welcome to the Medieval and Renaissance Studies lecture that we have today from Dr. Jason Kerr. This is a lecture on Milton's Oath, Vows, and Christian Liberty. I'm so excited for this lecture, and this is actually the first one that we've had all year in the Medieval and Renaissance Studies program. So thank you, everyone, for supporting this. Let me just introduce our speaker. So Dr. Jason Kerr is Associate Professor of English at Brigham Young University, where he teaches courses in early modern British literature and the Bible as literature. His research works at the intersection of literature, politics, and theology. Recent articles treat Elizabeth Attaway, who organized public preaching by women in 1640, London. Catherine Phillips, an Anglo-Welsh poet who developed proto-lesbian ecclesiology in response to the religious upheavals of the 17th century civil wars, and an attempt to disentangle Milton's thinking about Christ's redemptive work from the influence of 19th century dogmatic theology on modern approaches to that topic. He's also the author of Milton's Theological Process, Reading De Doctrina Christiana and Paradise Lost, which is published by Oxford University Press in 2023. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Kerr. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you have my talk.
Oh, sorry.
That can be very helpful. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's delightful to see so many here to hear a talk on Milton. And here's the part where I confess that I work on the obscurer bits. And so we'll see how this goes. And there will be a Q&A at the end. So if you get lost, you have a chance to call me on it. So my title, as you see here, is Oaths, Vows, and Christian Liberty in Milton's De Doctrina Christiana. Will this work? There we go. All right. During the 17th century, and especially its tumultuous middle decades, Britain was a graveyard of loyalty oaths. Rapidly shifting political circumstances meant that yesteryear's politically expedient oath could, and often did, become an albatross around the necks of people obliged to swear a different oath, occasioned by circumstances just as urgent and often just as fleeting. A common framework for thinking about all these oaths appears in the work of the nonconformist minister Richard Baxter. I'll put a slide of him in a second, who found himself perpetually offering pastoral advice to people about how to navigate the tangles of conscience occasioned by oaths. For instance, he spends some 20 pages of his massive memoir, Reliquiae Baxterianae, working through the arguments for and against swearing the 1665 Oxford Oath in light of the 1643 Solemn League and Covenant, a discussion informed by the crises of conscience already ignited by the 1649 Engagement and the 1661 Corporation Act's imposition of an oath specifically renouncing the Solemn League and Covenant. So oaths obliging you to renounce previous oaths. Great fun. Simply keeping all the oaths straight is no mean task. That's why I'm giving you this slide. So the recent Oxford edition of the Reliquiae Baxterianae includes a detailed catalog of oaths from the period that runs to 6 closely printed pages. Further complicating the picture, the distinction between oaths, or promises that invoke God as a witness, and vows, or promises made directly to God, begin to blur in this period, as Alex Garganigo and Edward Valence have shown. The 1643 Vow and Covenant offers a case of vows and oaths overlapping, along with notions of national covenant and political allegiance. And after 1660, language of vows became a way to avoid the Restoration prohibition against discussing oaths. Thinking about how to navigate so many competing promises made the topic of oaths and vows concrete concerns that weighed on the consciences of many people in the mid-17th century. So here's Baxter and Milton. Conscience is an important topic for John Milton, leading to recent scholarly treatments by Abraham Stoll and Joshua Held. Their books, however, offer at best scant discussion of oaths and vows, for the simple reason that Milton, unlike Baxter and many others among his contemporaries, does not think about oaths primarily in terms of conscience. Indeed, in De Doctrina Christiana, where he offers his most detailed treatment of these topics, Milton is at pains to extricate oaths from the webs of conscience by providing an alternative approach based on governing concepts of liberty and capacity rooted in natural law. Perhaps because Milton handles oaths in a way so unlike many contemporaries, and perhaps because this discussion is buried in the little-read second book of De Doctrina Christiana in chapters 4 and 5, there is surprisingly little scholarship on the subject. Alex Garganigo's recent book, Samson's Chords, is a salutary exception, albeit one whose focus is primarily on the years after 1660, when the monarchy was restored. And then the question takes a different shape than it had in the late 1650s, as Milton was busily revising De Doctrina Christiana. Garganigo's title alludes to Milton's most prominent discussion of vows in Samson Agonistes, published in 1671, also probably a text written in the Restoration period. What Milton thought about oaths and vows in the 1640s and 50s during the Civil Wars and the period of the interregnum, this remains mostly uncharted territory. So I put up a helpful timeline for people. I'm assuming that not everyone is deeply entangled in this period as I am. So instead of framing oaths and vows in terms of conscience, De Doctrina Christiana focuses on intertwined questions of liberty and human capacity. Although the broad contours of Milton's thinking on these questions remains fairly consistent throughout the 1640s and 50s, the manuscript of De Doctrina Christiana reveals that Milton labored over them considerably as the topic of vows intersected with the topic of baptism, where Milton, perhaps newly, espoused believers' baptism on the grounds that such a vow requires a person capacitated to enter into it, thus ruling out infant baptism. This was a hot debate of the time, believe it or not. Milton was likely revising these topics during the years 1658 to 1660, when his primary amanuensis, Jeremy Picard, is documented to have been in his employ. These were especially febrile years in terms of political allegiance. Richard Cromwell succeeded his father as protector in September 1658 before falling from power in April-May 1659, followed by a year of rapidly shifting and often uncertain political structures prior to the restoration of the monarchy in May 1660. I'm still waiting for a really good BBC miniseries on 1659. Great fun. Milton's embrace of believers' baptism in this political context is significant. Because believers' baptism is a matter of ecclesiology, or the theology of what constitutes a church, as well as one of personal capacity, as Matthew C. Bingham has argued, Milton's acceptance of this principle also speaks to his diminishing faith in the people of England being sufficiently capacitated and free as the Restoration approached to secure a broad national covenant by recourse to vows and oaths. Milton, however, frequently addresses this sense of national incapacitation in terms of disability that sit at some tension with his own experience of blindness from 1652 on, which opponents leveraged against him in attacks on his own ability to participate in political discourse. Disability thus emerges as a dimension of Milton's thinking about oaths and the terms of political belonging. So now we're going to head into the meat of the paper a little bit. Milton's writings prior to 1658, and that's why I've got this chart up here to give you some orientation. Milton's writings prior to 1658 consider the relevance of oaths and vows across multiple dimensions of human life, ecclesiastical, conjugal, and political, revealing that his concern for tyrannical abuses of power consistently outweighs his concern for personal conscience. In the anti-prelatical tracts of the early 1640s, he writes, often satirically, about oaths and vows as abusive tools of power. In Animadversions, for instance, he suggests that in the time of Cyprian, the 3rd century North African bishop, critics of episcopacy would not find themselves, quote, strappadoed with an oath ex officio, which refers to a means of securing self-incrimination in legal contexts. Vows, meanwhile, unduly constrain the liberty of bishops themselves. He says, "You have vowed yourself fairly between the Scylla and Charybdis, either of impudence or nonsense, and now betake you to whether you please." Milton does invoke conscience in The Reason of Church Government when he registers the objection, quote, that he who would take orders must subscribe slave and take an oath withal, unless he took with a conscience that would retch. He must either straight perjure or split his faith. Concluding, "I thought it better to prefer a blameless silence before the sacred office of speaking, bought and begun with servitude and forswearing." The one reference to conscience appears alongside two to slavery or servitude, which is where Milton's greater concern seems persistently to lie. A similar emphasis on liberty informs Milton's discussion of marriage in the Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, where the distinction between oaths invoking God as witness and vows made directly to God begins to break down. He compares marriage, quote, with all other covenants and vows warrantably broken for the good of man. He's advocating divorce. Covenants involve oaths. So every covenant between man and man, bound by oath, may be called the covenant of God because God therein is attested. Nevertheless, covenants and vows are sacrosanct in an identical way. There are a couple seats right up here. Come on in. So covenants and vows are sacrosanct in an identical way. What covenant more contracted with God and less in man's power than the vow which hath once passed his lips? This similarity underwrites the way that for Milton, either vows or covenants may be broken if found at odds with some higher law. Quote, yet if it be found rash, if offensive, if unfruitful either to God's glory or the good of man, our doctrine forces not error and unwillingness irksomely to keep it, but counsels wisdom and better thoughts boldly to break it. To do otherwise would be, quote, to make an idol of marriage, to advance it above the worship of God and the good of man, to make it a transcendent command above both the second and first table of the Ten Commandments, which is a most prodigious doctrine. Milton partly collapses the distinction between oaths and vows, but he also suggests that approaching them too conscientiously might amount to self-enslavement. Although right worship is a core concern in Milton's discussion, liberty governs his treatment of oaths, vows, and covenants. Unlike with Baxter, Milton's overt references to the major state-imposed oaths are rare. The address to Parliament that opens Tetrachordon, one of the later divorce tracts, indicates that Milton saw and was partaker of your vows and solemn covenants, likely referring to the 1643 Vow and Covenant, swiftly followed in the same year by the more prominent Solemn League and Covenant. In the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates of 1649, Milton launches an extended attack against Presbyterians who opposed the regicide on grounds of conscientious adherence to oaths, specifically the oaths of supremacy and allegiance alongside the Solemn League and Covenant, that Milton argues they had broken by going to war against the king. More importantly, or pointedly, he also argues that King Charles had broken his coronation oath, dissolving the people's obligations. Indeed, Milton is much more broadly interested in the oaths that limit monarchical power than he is in the oaths that the state extracts from people under its power. Earlier in the Tenure, he argues that royal non-execution or misapplication of the law leaves the people with no remedy but, quote, to put conditions and take oaths from all kings and magistrates at their first installment to do impartial justice by law, holding that such authorities, quote, upon these terms and no other, received allegiance from the people. Milton develops this view of contractual monarchy at length in Pro Populo Anglicano Defensio, 1650. If imposed oaths can bring about problems of conscience for those who swear them, Milton is more concerned about the acts of tyranny that impose such oaths in the first place. Both aspects of this position appear in his poem on the new forcers of conscience under the Long Parliament, where Milton jibes at the stiff vows with which Presbyterians have renounced prelatical or episcopal liturgy, less out of high-minded principle than out of a desire to seize clerical power for themselves. Not only are their qualms of conscience hypocritical, but they also underwrite a desire to constrain others' liberties, and that's what Milton is really angry about. Milton's writings from 1658 to 1660, and now we're approaching the period where he's working on De Doctrina Christiana. These writings bring a new urgency to this theme of liberty as the supreme law, and this coincides also with just the breakdown of the government. He only discusses vows in print in Considerations Touching the Likeliest Means to Remove Hirelings Out of the Church of 1659, written in support of a position for the restored Rump Parliament to abolish tithes. Discussing that example of Jacob in Genesis 28:22, Milton argues that he, of his free choice, not enjoined by any law, vowed the tenth of all that God should give him. So the point is that the state can't enforce tithes. People are free to give them if they wish. Later, Milton declares that, quote, forced consecrations out of another man's estate are no better than forced vows, hateful to God, who loves a cheerful giver. The validity of vows is conditioned on non-coercion. Now, Milton's discussion of oaths proves more complicated. The topic surfaces in the second edition of The Ready and Easy Way, published in April 1660, as the restoration was imminent but not yet assured. It happened in May. Early in the text, he suggests that the validity of oaths resides in their connection to the people's safety and liberty. He claims that the Parliament understood that, quote, the solemn engagement, and that's a reference to a state oath of 1649, the solemn engagement wherein we all forswore kingship was no more a breach of the covenant than the covenant was of the protestation before, but a faithful and prudent going on both in the words, well weighed, and in the true sense of the covenant, without respect of persons. Here he's quoting an oath. When we could not serve two contrary masters, God and the king, or the king and that more supreme law sworn in the first place to maintain our safety and our liberty. Referring to a sequence of oaths that people have been enjoined to swear, the engagement of 1649, the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643, and the Protestation of 1641, Milton attempts to cut through the perceived contradictions among them that brought so many painful cases of conscience into Baxter's pastoral ambit. Milton is not entirely immune to such concerns. He worries a few pages later that swearing an oath to a new king would bring, quote, the whole sea of blood guiltiness upon our own heads, because he had written in defense of beheading the king. If a concern for safety and liberty can dissolve contradictions among oaths whose underlying purpose was to preserve them, that concern also weighs against entering into oaths whose purpose is bondage, at least as Milton sees it. Seeing the question, as it were, from the other side of the throne, Milton argues in Brief Notes Upon a Late Sermon, this is also an early 1660 text, that the coronation oath subordinates the king to law. Quote, and how could a person be absolutely supreme who reigned not under law only, but under oath of his good demeanor given to the people at his coronation, ere the people gave him the crown? Oaths, whether undertaken by people or magistrates, should function to preserve liberty, not to constrain it. Liberty is the supreme law. Milton's persistent invocations of liberty as the supreme law show the influence of natural law thinking. He makes the connection explicit in a quotable line from the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. No man who knows aught can be so stupid as to deny that all men naturally were born free. And I'll read the rest of it. Being the image and resemblance of God himself, and were by privilege above all the creatures, born to command and not to obey, and that they lived so. In this formulation, liberty is part of a natural, universally shared human condition, which enables Milton to condemn actions by monarchs or others that impede liberty, while also affording him a foundation for political speech, enjoining others to resist tyranny. Although this essay cannot treat Milton's complex relationship with natural law at length, its salience to his thinking about oaths means that it remains a persistent touch point. So that's the kind of survey of Milton's thinking about vows and oaths in the 1640s and 50s, and now we're going to dive specifically into De Doctrina Christiana, where he handles the topic at the greatest length. So Milton's discussion of oaths in De Doctrina Christiana, Book 2, Chapter 5, on oath-taking and decision by lot, is broadly consistent with that developed in his earlier writings. Nevertheless, the topic seems to have occasioned some difficulty for him, raising the question of why it did so. In the interest of time and intelligibility, I will simply note that the manuscript indicates Milton's argument expanding under revision, apparently involving his extended handling of a familiar case of conscience involving the validity of oaths made to thieves, pirates, or similar persons whose actions occur outside the bounds of law and honor. Milton treats this case in a long paragraph that spans 3 pages, and I put these pages from the manuscript up here, bridging 2 folios. So this is where it shows that he's expanded what he had originally written on the topic. And he refers back to his treatment in a later discussion in the chapter. So the case is composed of several questions drawn together from various sources across its long history, including Cicero, Thomas Aquinas, and Milton's most significant interlocutors, the Reformed theologians William Ames and Johannes Volleb. The key questions are whether one is bound to pay ransom to pirates after swearing to do so. I promise that I will pay you this money if you set me free, right? Whether one is bound by oaths of silence made to pirates. I promise I won't tell the authorities you're pirates. And whether one owes a prior bond of allegiance to political authorities that might obviate oaths made to pirates. So I've already sworn to the king, therefore my vow to you is no good, right? Milton addresses these questions by appealing to natural law as something that has a prior claim over even allegiance to political authorities, who also have obligations to govern in accordance with natural law. The case takes influential form in Cicero's De Officiis, so we're going to kind of do the genealogy of this case quickly. And so Cicero recounts the case of Regulus, a consul who was taken prisoner in North Africa and then sent to the Senate on parole, sworn to return to Carthage himself if certain noble prisoners of war were not returned to the Carthaginians. Rather than break his oath and remain at Rome, where he could be with his family and enjoy the dignity of an ex-consul, he advised the Senate not to exchange prisoners, refusing to vote because his oath to an enemy, in his view, nullified his membership in the Senate. And then he returned to Carthage, where he was slowly tortured to death. So a man who took his oath very seriously. Some interpreters of Regulus's case considered his actions morally incorrect because what an enemy extorted by force ought not to have been binding. Responding to this interpretation, Cicero presents a case involving pirates. You didn't know there were going to be pirates. For example, suppose that one does not deliver the amount agreed upon with pirates as the price of one's life. That would be accounted no deception, not even if one should fail to deliver the ransom after having sworn to do so. For a pirate is not included in the number of lawful enemies, but is the common foe of all the world. And with him there ought not to be any pledged word, nor any oath mutually binding. Cicero concludes that this case is not pertinent to that of Regulus, who is dealing with a legitimate declared enemy rather than with pirates. Although a magistrate's prior claim to allegiance is not the issue here, the reliance of oaths on some transcendent framework of lawfulness makes the cases analogous. By the time Milton took up the case, the question of whether an oath to pay ransom obliged one to do so had been augmented with a second question involving exacted oaths of silence, that is, promises not to tell anyone, especially the authorities, about the thieves or their notorious actions, or nefarious actions. On this second question, Thomas Aquinas offers an influential analysis in the Summa Theologiae. Responding to the observation that the pontiff or the pope releases people from the bond of oaths that they were unwillingly compelled to swear, Thomas writes that oaths have a twofold obligation. One obligation is to the person to whom the promise is made, and this obligation ceases because of compulsion, since one who uses force does not deserve to have the promise fulfilled. The other obligation is to God, and this requires that a man do what was promised in God's name. This obligation remains on one's conscience because, rather than violate an oath, a man ought to suffer temporal loss. He can, however, sue in court to recover what he has paid or denounce the matter to the proper superior, even if he swore to the contrary, for such an oath would lead to evil results and thus be contrary to public justice. The Roman pontiffs, in absolving men from an oath of this kind, do not pronounce such oaths to be invalid, but rather mitigate the obligation for some just cause. Thomas joins with Cicero in thinking of oaths as something sacred, but unlike in the case of Regulus, who had sworn an oath to enemies in a war, Thomas imagines a situation in which there is some authority acting as it were in God's place, who can intervene when the costs of faithfulness to oaths risks becoming unjust. Thus, one both pays the ransom and sues in court to recover it, but one outright violates the oath of silence. Notably, Thomas grounds this obligation to break one's oath not in a prior allegiance to the powers that be, but in the evil results that would be contrary to public justice. The Roman pontiff who mitigates such oaths is not acting as a sovereign, but as a party empowered to facilitate an objectively just result. Obligation to God brings right worship into the picture, but in practice, the emphasis falls on natural law. Possible conflicts with oaths made to political authorities became a major feature of Reformation era casuistry, or thinking about cases of conscience. The biblical text at the heart of this dispute is Romans 13:1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Thomas Fulton has traced competing interpretations of this verse through the 16th and 17th centuries. One, identified with John Colet and Desiderius Erasmus, that uses historical context to qualify its scope and interpretation, and another identified with William Tyndale that interprets interprets it as a divine injunction against resistance to magistrates. Tyndale's hard line provokes the question of whether obedience to God might ever require resistance to magistrates. On this point, writing a few decades later, John Calvin waffles. On the obedience side, he argued infamously that Scripture required obedience even to bad kings. It is as if Samuel had said, the willfulness of kings will run to excess, but it will not be your part to restrain it. You will have only this left to you, to obey their commands and hearken to their word. Nevertheless, Calvin's extended case for obedience yields, in the final paragraph of the Institutes, to an acknowledgement of its potential limits. But in that obedience, which we have shown to be due the authority of rulers, we are always to make this exception, indeed to observe it as primary, that such obedience is never to lead us away from obedience to him, to whose will the desires of all kings ought to be subject, to whose decree all their commands ought to yield, to whose majesty their scepters ought to be submitted. Calvin addresses both sides of the tension that framed an ongoing debate in early modern political theology, producing works that emphasize the scope of obedience, like Thomas Bilson's 1585, The True Difference Between Christian Subjection and Unchristian Rebellion, and works that explore its limits, like the 1579 French tract Vindiciae contra Tyrannos, published anonymously for obvious reasons. Milton takes up this case of the validity of oaths made to thieves in De Doctrina Christiana in conversation with his two most significant interlocutors, Ames and Volleb. Ames invokes the possibility of oaths made to illegitimate rulers while working through the implication of Calvin's observation that obedience to human authority must not become disobedience to God. Immediately after asserting that if the oath, quote, that if the oath be against the commandments of God, it doth not bind, because an oath ought not to be a bond of iniquity, he presents this case. Yet an oath made in some manner against the command of God doth sometime bind, as when the Jews, to whom freedom was promised, did swear to be subject to strangers into whose power they came. By implication, even if divine will favors the restoration of the Davidic monarchy, this fact does not authorize anyone to break oaths of allegiance sworn to the heathen usurper. For Ames, getting out of an oath is no small matter. Hence also there can be no release, properly so called, commuting or dispensation and absolution from an oath come from man. Although some oaths, which were either unlawful from the beginning or afterward became so, may be by men pronounced to be void. These exceptions are in practice very narrow. People can lack the capacity to enter valid oaths. They that do not use reason so as they cannot understand the nature of an oath are not capable of an oath. This appeal to rational capacity shows that Ames's thinking about oaths participates in the natural law tradition inherited from Thomas and others. Additionally, oaths that promise some future action lose their binding force only if he to whom the promise is made doth either remit or take away that foundation whereupon it was grounded. Consequently, to the case at hand, even extorted oaths remain binding. Faith that is confirmed by a lawful oath is to be kept, the same circumstances remaining, even to enemies, thieves, and pirates. For if the respect of the persons doth not make the oath unlawful, it cannot make it of no force. An oath that is extorted by fear doth not cease to bind in that respect, because those acts which are said to be extorted from a man by fear, if they proceed from counsel, they are simply voluntary, though not absolutely spontaneous or of good will. Even though the parties extorting such oaths are by definition bad, the oaths remain valid so long as the person swearing had sufficient faculties of reason and the thieves or pirates kept their side of the bargain, for instance, to release the swearer if the agreed ransom was paid. If oaths sworn even to the likes of thieves and pirates are binding, oaths sworn to kings and magistrates must remain indissoluble. Neither in Ames's Medulla, the Marrow of Sacred Divinity, nor in his subsequent work of Casuistry de Conscientia, does he address oaths to remain silent about the thieves or their actions. Volleb, Milton's other major interlocutor, does take up this question, though, and his formulation seems to provide the nearest entry point for Milton's response. Oaths must be kept, says Volleb, though they be extorted from us and hurtful to us. He writes, citing Psalm 15:4, that sweareth to his hurt and changeth not. Volleb follows this not with exegesis, but with a philosophical query. And this is what's on this slide. But here it is demanded, if an oath be made to a thief to free ourselves from him, ought to be kept. Answer. Either the oath is only to redeem ourselves, or else it is to conceal the whole matter. We are bound in the former to keep our promise, but not in the latter, seeing we are first and more strictly bound to the magistrate, whose office it is to suppress thieves and robbing. Therefore, whosoever out of fear of death binds himself to a thief in this respect, he may declare the matter to the magistrate, and by reason of the tie and obligation to him, he may be absolved by public authority. Here, finally, is a version of the case in which the magistrate's prior claim to obedience takes precedence over other oaths. By the end of the 1650s, Milton cannot sign on to this reasoning. He is an advocate of beheading kings. He is willing enough to grant Voleb's argument about the relative strength of the prior oath. When the matter has been brought before the magistrate, the oath extorted against one's will is annulled by the public authority of the prior oath, and the weaker bond gives way to the stronger. But for Milton, this reasoning likewise dissolves the oath involving ransom, seeing also that every single person is constrained by the very strict duty of a good man not to support robbers with his money. This response shifts the framing of the question away from obedience to authority and toward the kind of natural law thinking on evidence in Cicero and Thomas. A person with Milton's education could hardly have avoided reading De Officiis, which he refers to as that golden book in his 1655 Pro Se Defensio. And he joins Cicero in considering thieves as enemies to law itself, and so not eligible recipients of oaths. If we should regard the robber as someone with whom no consideration, either of religion or civil law or of private duty, can come into play, at least in the matter of the actual robbery, we cannot enter into any agreement with a thief. Like Thomas, whom he is less certain to have read, he prefers to think about the magistrates releasing people from such oaths not as an act of sovereignty or as the effect of a prior oath to the magistrate, but simply as pointing people back to the very strict duty of a good man. The question is one of personal ethics rather than anything to do with the state or its agents. Having removed the magistrate from consideration, Milton turns to the matter of religious scruple. Requiring people to fulfill oaths made to robbers as a matter of conscience is, for Milton, utterly wrong-headed. So whatever oath we have sworn under duress, we have sinned only once. But if, influenced by religious scruples, we should carry out a wrongful oath, then we do not so much fulfill a pledge, which should not have been given, or give honor to God, as we double the sin and bind ourselves more tightly with a bond of iniquity. Here Milton sides with Cicero and Thomas, and here Milton sides with Cicero against Thomas and those like him, who divided oaths into an obligation to God and an obligation to the other human party. For Cicero, the expediency of Regulus's retaining his freedom carried more weight than religious scruple. It is the universally accepted view of all philosophers, this is Cicero, both Stoics and Epicureans, that God is never angry, never hurtful. Consequently, what greater injury could Jupiter have inflicted upon Regulus than Regulus brought upon himself? Religious scruple, therefore, had no such preponderancy as to outweigh so great expediency. In Milton's view, the notion that some obligation to God could require someone to keep a wrongful oath is not merely ludicrous, but because it would bind one with a bond of iniquity, is more importantly at fundamental odds with right worship and Christian liberty. Milton's conclusion is withering. Because of this, if anyone is forced by a thief to swear such an oath, it seems that he should concentrate on how his life can be safeguarded rather than on how a pledge or obligation extorted by a thief ought to be kept. Conscientious Presbyterians are tying themselves in knots for nothing, Milton says. Oaths exacted by the state are not binding if they put the lives of those swearing at risk, if they oblige something iniquitous, or if they otherwise enslave people whom Christ has set free. Notably, Milton's alternative to conscience appeals not only to Christian liberty, but also to the natural law principle of self-preservation. Noting a turn toward natural law thinking as a principle of scriptural interpretation in Milton's divorce tracts, Jason Rosenblatt observes that this gesture attempts to provide a universally accessible basis for judgment, distinct from sectarian commitments. Nevertheless, as the next sections will argue, Milton's thinking about oaths and vows turns on questions of capacity in ways that trouble this impulse toward universal accessibility. This is why I was alluding to disability back at the beginning. Okay, so now we're going to turn to vows. If Milton's treatment of oaths in De Doctrina Christiana involved a messy process of revision, vows proved even more troublesome. The topic of vows links the two most materially complex chapters in the surviving Picard manuscript. Book 1, chapter 28, this is a page from that chapter, on the external sealing of the covenant of grace, and book 2, chapter 4, on external worship, where he addresses vows. Again, in the interest of time, I will omit the gritty details about the manuscript, but I'd be happy to say more in the Q&A if anyone's interested. So the link between these two chapters appears amidst the discussion of believers' baptism in book 1, chapter 28, and this is the relevant page of the manuscript. So on the last page of that chapter's first folio, where Milton begins to present his view in favor of believers' baptism, and you can see the word credentium in Latin up there indicating that. The margin contains a rare internal reference, and I've translated it. You can see it scribbled over on the side. Besides, baptism is not only a covenant, in which if an express pledge is involved, so is an assurance, which is beyond an infant. But it is also a vow, which can be neither uttered by nor exacted from an infant, on which see below book 2, chapter 4, concerning vow. I take this reference to suggest not that that chapter initially bore the title on vows, but that readers are to seek the topic within the chapter. Now, rather than signal a reference to fully worked out material, this citation seems to indicate a realization that emerged amidst a flurry of revision in book 2, chapter 4. Milton's common practice in working on the treatise involved reading Volleb and Ames, these two Reformed divines we've already met, considering their engagement with Scripture, and seeking additional scriptural passages relevant to the topic at hand. The discussion of vows in book 2, chapter 4 indicates some of the complexities that can result from this method. Milton's basic logical structure aligns closely with Volleb, who follows the discussion of prayer with its treatment of its outward helps, fasting and vows. Milton's language very nearly echoes Volleb's. Prayer supports our fasting and vows, which Milton initially copied verbatim and then added, and sometimes accompanied with an oath, bringing our two topics together. At the end of the definition, he inserted scriptural passages from Psalm 109 and Nehemiah 10 that further connect oaths to the topic of vows. The logic of the division between the chapters is beginning to blur, the chapter on oath and now the chapter on vows, or the other way around. Milton's engagement with Volleb leads to a logical irresolution occasioned by the topic of baptism. And get ready for a deep dive, sorry for the joke. Milton follows Volleb in distinguishing between special and general vows, but the way that the distinction plays out in Volleb causes trouble for Milton. Volleb defines general vows as things involving things commanded and required of all men. I think we're not quite here yet, but adding such is the vow of baptism. Milton's departure from Volleb begins when he divides general vows into public, one which the whole church vows, and private, which is vowed by an individual, such as the baptismal vow. Milton does not discuss baptism at this point, but introduces the next topic in language closely mirroring Volleb's. A special vow concerns things which are certainly lawful but not yet commanded, and is undertaken for special reasons. Following some anti-papal polemic against vows of celibacy and poverty, Milton rejoins Volleb by setting conditions for who can enter special vows. And now we're at this slide. Volleb excludes from such vows those who want as yet use of judgment and reason, or who are not masters of themselves, but are subject either to parents or husbands. Rah-rah feminism. Milton echoes this natural law definition, but with a polemical addendum. No one, however, can declare either a general or a special vow who, on grounds of age, is not yet endowed with reason and judgment. Seeing that this is the received rule of theologians, it is amazing how forgetful of their own teaching they are found when they demand a special vow, that of baptism, from infants. Here the situation has become very jumbled indeed. Milton has accused the theologians of demanding a special vow from infants, but the theologian he has manifestly been reading explicitly treats baptism as a general vow, just as he himself has done. What is going on? My sense is that Milton thinks he has caught Volleb in a contradiction involving capacity. In contrast to Ames, who holds that baptism involves only a passive receiving, meaning that infants are as capable of the sacrament in respect of the chief use of it as those of age are, Volleb argues that infants do possess the necessary faculties. Infants have both faith and reason, although not in the fruit, yet in the seed and root, though not in the second act, yet in the first, though not by an outward demonstration of the work, yet by the inward virtue of the Holy Spirit. Whereas he later raises the question of capacity only regarding special vows, this claim that infants have sufficient capacity to undergo baptism either makes the question of capacity pertain to general vows or makes baptism, contrary to Volleb's claim, a special vow, which requires that a person not be subject to parents. Milton's comment has it both ways, making vows of all kinds subject to questions of capacity and implying that Volleb has scrambled his categories here. Now, pulling back to the larger picture, which those were thick weeds, I will admit, we can see that Milton's polemic about vows and baptism appears in the context of an argument that people should not make special vows to abstain from things that God does not wish to be forbidden. Milton does not make the connection explicitly, but this argument comports with his concern to preserve Christian liberty, especially against what he sees as Catholic encroachments. That concern seems to motivate expansion of the chapter where baptism resurfaces as a topic and might have put pressure on the questions about the capacity required to undertake vows as these questions emerged in Volleb. The material state of Book 1, Chapter 28 indicates that Milton had already become an adherent of believers' baptism when these developments unfold. So the manuscript of Book 2, Chapter 4 shows Milton reinforcing his view rather than changing his mind. But the vows, whether special or general, require people, or the idea that vows, whether special or general, require people capacitated to undertake them, opens the door to understanding the possible political implications of Milton's theology amidst the complex situation of 1658-60. So now we get into the political bit, and this is moving toward the conclusion. The way that Milton handles oaths made to thieves helps to draw out the political stakes in his embrace of believers' baptism, especially if that development occurred in the tumultuous final years of the 1650s. The debates about baptism that began to gather speed in the 1630s are not, after all, only about when a person ought to be baptized as a child or as an adult believer, or even about the underlying issue of capacity. Rather, they are at heart debates about ecclesiology, what constitutes the church. Matthew C. Bingham's book, Orthodox Radicals, has recently brought new emphasis to the fact that the debates about believers' baptism arose within Congregationalist churches, where adult membership was already premised in part on a person's decision to associate with the church. The issue was what to do about the children, a question that prompted similar debates across the Atlantic about the so-called halfway covenant. People wanted their children to belong to the community that mattered so much to them, but this desire was in tension with the idea that participation in the community needed to be freely chosen. Given the already prominent role of Christian liberty in shaping Milton's Congregationalist ecclesiology, it is perhaps not surprising that he came to embrace believers' baptism. At least in principle, I'm not aware of any evidence suggesting that he received believers' baptism himself. Believers' baptism makes the church a voluntary association of the capable. The years between 1658 and 1660 saw a similar problem of belonging play out in the political sphere. Edward Valence has drawn attention to oaths of association as a persistent feature of the early modern religio-political landscape. And these are not state-imposed oaths, but people undertake oaths voluntarily in kind of what we could call like proto-political parties. They understand themselves as aligned with the state, but freely. So sometimes such oaths, although vows might be the better word, operate in support of a political regime understood as aligned with the national covenant. But there is an intrinsic tension between such associations and the state. So let's say you have an oath of association that's aligned with the people in power and you think that God is on your side, and then the script flips, everything gets messy, not relatable at all. Okay, so oaths of association in this way create something like a nation within the nation. The real Americans, so to speak, right? Where national covenants aspire to encompass the nation as a whole. The state, meanwhile, does not restrict its jurisdiction to the willing alone, by definition. Milton's writings of the late 1650s occupy both sides of this tension. In De Doctrina Christiana, Milton identifies public vows, those sworn by the whole church, with covenants, and his Congregationalist ecclesiology suggests that these covenants look more like voluntary associations than national covenants. Meanwhile, in the Ready and Easy Way, he emphasizes the importance of national covenants because liberty of conscience seems impossible without them. Only within a covenanted nation can the freedom of discussion that ought to characterize a church, in Milton's view, become feasible at scale. Whereas nonconformists would continue to pursue forms of association, Milton seems not to consider that an option. The prospect of restoring monarchy signals a nation unable to swear oaths or undertake vows, so what would be the point? He can only despair, fearing that people will break the covenant by choosing them a captain back for Egypt. This is the second quote here. Meaning that they are choosing the coercive state, monarchy, over conditions of liberty. Amidst these fears, he speaks persistently in the language of capacity. This is now the first quote here. Thus much I should perhaps have said, though I were sure I should have spoken only to trees and stones, and had none to cry to, but with the prophet, O earth, 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 to tell the very soil itself what her perverse inhabitants are deaf to. In contrast to Baxter, Milton is less concerned with the tangles of conscience that can arise from oaths and vows than with the underlying capacity to enter into them. Nevertheless, this passage is one among many where Milton rhetorically conflates the chosen incapacitation of self-enslavement with disability. With this conflation, Milton's appeals to rationality acquire an instrumental exclusionary force. In ecclesiological terms, his gathered church of baptized believers becomes an exclusivist club, rather than one node in a larger invisible church characterized by Christian liberty. Both loyalty oaths and Milton's appeals to natural law thinking mark attempts to expand allegiance and belonging beyond the already converted. But these apparently broad-minded gestures instead end up accentuating the fragility of belonging even within the core group. Sitting in the middle of this dilemma are questions about disability that cut to the heart of the frameworks for political belonging that appeal to human capacity or strong notions of individual autonomous choice, and that therefore ultimately founder on the shoals of human finitude and interdependence. Thank you. All right, we have time, I believe, and I'm happy to take questions.